Hey there guys, come to while away your time watching YouTube videos? Well, look no further, because today I'm going to talk about a subject that on the surface at least seems ridiculously relevant, the turbine car. It seems like a crazy idea, but it's been around for a long time. It was first commercially used back in 1939, and the most famous application of this engine on a car was the Chrysler turbine car that was developed throughout the 50s and 60s. We will discuss cars like these in more detail as we move along in the video, but first, a more pressing question. Why? Why do we even need a turbine car in the first place? Well, if you take a minute to just unpack a question like this, you can see right away that there were many advantages, which is why so many people were interested in this turbine technology in the first place. Firstly, a turbine engine had much fewer moving parts than a combustion engine, and this meant that maintaining it then became that much easier. If you look at fluids like oil, you rarely had to change them, if at all. Another major advantage for the turbine engine was that it ran on an array of fuels. As long as the liquid was combustible with oxygen, you could use it to power the engine. This meant that fuels such as kerosene, biofuel, natural gas, and a whole lot more, these all worked on the turbine car. In addition to all this, the turbine engine supposedly made for a much smoother driving experience. Though, as we're going to see, there were a lot of drawbacks about the driving experience with a turbine engine. So, that's quite a few major advantages, but what did this all really lead to? Well, for that, we have to return to the Chrysler Corporation. To be perfectly clear, there were other companies before Chrysler that came up with working concepts for a turbine car, but Chrysler was really the first company that was able to create a working model that they truly believed they could mass produce. After World War II, a group of Chrysler engineers were tasked with researching the turbine engine and, of course, more specifically, its applicability in the automotive industry. The company created its first true concept when it took the 1954 Plymouth Belvedere and combined it with the turbine engine. Now, as this was their first working concept, and the turbine engine had about 20% fewer parts and weighed about 200 pounds less than a traditional combustion engine. The rest of the 50s and 60s saw Chrysler creating their second and third generation turbine engines, and we saw these being used on the Plymouth Fury and the Dodge Dart. But, up to this point, most of Chrysler's efforts were purely experimental. Now, the fourth generation, that's where things started to change. With the introduction of the fourth generation engine, Chrysler also announced a program in which they would loan 50 cars out to the general public so that they could see what it would be like to actually own a turbine car. Now, as part of this program, the members of the public who received these cars, they got to keep them for about 3 months, and at the end of this entire ordeal, they were interviewed by Chrysler so that the company could get a better understanding for the experience that these members had driving these cars. The fourth generation engine that was equipped on these cars only weighed about 410 pounds and had 80% less parts than a traditional combustion engine. So it's fair to say that over the last couple of generations, Chrysler engineers had made immense progress. Because of the simple design, the engine didn't require a cooling system, connecting rods, or a crankshaft. As I stated before, the turbine engine can be powered by numerous different fuels, but it was the Mexican president, Adolfo López Mateo, who really put this to the test when he decided that he wanted to power his turbine car with tequila. Spoiler alert, it worked. After the 3-month loan period, as I said, Chrysler took back all the cars and ultimately destroyed 46 of them. But their turbine engine development program continued with a 5th and 6th generation engine before it was ultimately shut down in 1979. If you're wondering why it was shut down, stick around till the end of the video and everything shall be explained. Now, just to prove that this whole Chrysler program wasn't some one-off engineering escapade, I want to talk about it in a different respect, motorsport, more specifically, the Indy 500. Engineer Ken Wallace brought plans for a gas turbine engine to Andy Granatello, CEO of STP Racing back in the day. The two started work on their turbine race car in January of 1966, and when they turned up to the 1967 Indy 500, people were stunned to say the least. Their creation, the STP Paxton turbo car, came with a Pratt & Whitney aircraft engine that was mounted right beside where the driver, Parnelli Jones, sat. while it was a novel creation, still did fairly well for itself, in fact leading throughout most of the race before falling victim to a bearing failure. To respond to this failure, however, STP next year stepped up their game by forming a partnership with Colin Chapman, who just happened to own a little brand that you might know called Lotus, and together they created the Lotus 56. With the arrival of Lotus also came the arrival of legendary F1 driver Graham Hill, who raced alongside Joe Leonard and Art Pollard in that year's Indy 500. The car that year also did look very promising, but it came with its own set of problems. Driver Mark Spence was killed while testing one of these cars, which is why there were only 3 applicants in the race in the first place. In an extreme turn of bad luck, all 3 drivers failed to finish that year's race. Leonard's car was the closest to finishing, but ultimately he suffered fuel pump issues. After that year's Indy 500 race though, the race organizers decided to ban turbine cars and 4-wheel drive cars, which effectively put the Lotus 56 out of competition and consigned it to the history books. Up to this point, most of what I'm saying probably sounds like a history lesson, and like you, when I sat down to research all of this material, I wondered what sort of relevance concepts like these have in today's world. So that's why I decided to sit down with Keith Hilton, a man who's trying to keep the dream of the turbine car alive even today. Here's Keith's concept in a nutshell. Basically what he's created is a turbine-powered race car concept which he hopes can replace the modern-day IndyCar. IndyCar is a spec series, and basically what this means is that every team or driver starts off with the same car. Now what Keith would be looking to do is make the official spec car his turbine-powered concept. He has already generated a lot of interest in the motorsport community, even though at this particular moment his idea is still a concept and not yet a reality. Keith has already, however, contacted IndyCar about implementing his design and has arranged for a little British company named Rolls-Royce to provide him with engines for his concept. Now, as a racing fan, I was actually quite intrigued by Keith's concept, but naturally I had some questions about how he actually planned to bring his concept to fruition. But in my own opinion, I see one big problem for the turbine car is kind of the rise of the EV market, right? And you see a lot of manufacturers investing big time, big money into trying to make these cars of the future. So, when you see so much momentum going in that direction, what does that make you think?
It's disconcerting, but my feeling is that the EVs basically are transportation. We're not meant to be race cars. I've seen in person the Formula E. Not terribly exciting, at least for an old guy like me. So we confuse this thing with our support comes from the manufacturers, but we're in the entertainment business here. So if it goes around silently, it doesn't go very fast, it's not very entertaining. So I think we need to skip that, but we need to, we need to get a support base. I mean, back in the day, Formula One was really created by cigarette companies for the most part. Right? They had the money, right? And then it went to alcohol, and then cell phones, and so we kind of run the whole gamut. So not only do we have to change the car, we have to change the business model as well.
So you're one guy, and I feel not to take away from you, right? But especially when it comes to motorsport, right? Politics plays a very, very large role in how things are run, right? Sometimes it's just ridiculous. So, how can you just change the mind of where Chevrolet or whatever the IndyCar engine supplier and all that stuff?
The only chance we have is to show them, is to roll something out on 4 wheels, and and see how it goes. If it's beautiful, if it sounds good, if it races well, then the doubters will start to go away. But now, the Formula One and the IndyCar race on one track, and that's Circuit of the Americas. And the IndyCar is 14 seconds slower than the Formula One car on that track. Mm-hmm. Not terribly exciting. What we need to be able to do, and this is part of the plan, is to take our car to Circuit of the Americas and break the track record. At that point, we would start to get some respect.
For Keith, his motivation for using turbine engine technology essentially boils down to the idea that he believes there are some fundamental issues with how racing is being conducted today.
I just think we need to change the entire structure of racing in the United States, in my humble opinion. It's more like a franchise. You know, the football franchise and NHL, NBA, you know, been very successful partially because of their structure. Whereas, you know, we've had these families, you know, the NASCAR family, IndyCar, the Holmans for a long time, even Bernie Ecclestone. You know, they basically run these more or less of a fiefdom. And I think that business structure needs to be changed along with the cars at the same time.
At this most basic level, Keith is trying to institute change in an industry that is struggling to figure out what its future is. And as a racing fan, that's something that's very refreshing, because usually when you see rule changes, it's all done in the name of internal politics. Whereas with Keith, he actually has this fresh, new idea. Whatever your position is, motorsport undeniably is in a time of turmoil and does need some sort of concrete and ingenious idea to sustain its future. I shall stop myself there though, however, as this is a completely different discussion and can quite easily turn into another rant. While forward-minded individuals like Keith are trying to keep, the dream of the turbine car alive, there are also more mainstream manufacturers that have found maybe more subtle ways to implement turbine engine technology. Case in point, the Jaguar C-X75, which was actually the Bond car from Spectre, driven by the mad supervillain played by Dave Bautista. I mean, Jaguar does market themselves as the car brand of choice for criminals anyways. However, we're not going to talk about the moral character of Jaguar's clientele today. Instead, we're going to talk about the technology they've been creating. Essentially, as part of this concept, Jaguar wanted the C-X75 to be a hybrid which uses a gasoline engine to then drive 4 separate electric motors. Now, this is again not a new concept. In fact, it's already been quite well established in the market. Cars like the Fisker Karma and Top Gear's Hammerhead Eagle Eye Thrust are 2 great examples that come to mind. Where the Jaguar would differ, however, from its competitors would be the fact that it uses a turbine engine as its generator. To be quite honest, I don't really know why Jaguar thought that a turbine engine would be marketably better for its new prototype, but my best guess would be that the turbine engine is extremely efficient when being used at max capacity. And when it's being used as a generator, the engine could theoretically continue to work at max capacity no matter the actual speed of the car itself. Again, that's just what I think. In the grand scheme of things though, none of the speculation really matters, because Jaguar instead decided to move ahead with the conventional engine acting as its generator, but then, in a complete turn of events, they just simply decided they weren't going to make the car at all. So, I think this is as good a time as any to start talking about some of the drawbacks of the turbine engine. The first big issue is efficiency. Like I said before, turbine engines can actually be quite efficient when they're being used at max capacity. The problem is, we just don't do that in our daily driving. In an airliner, when you're traveling at a constant 600 miles per hour for long durations of time, a turbine engine makes sense, which is why it's been mostly used for large-scale applications. In addition, when the turbine engines are scaled down, which they have to be for the car, they lose a lot of their efficiency, yet again another reason why turbine engines have only been used for large-scale applications. Turbine engines in general also don't have very good emission ratings, which is why I was so stunned in the first place why Jaguar thought they would want to use it on their prototype. If we return to the example of the Chrysler, we see yet another set of problems for the consumer. The pickup wasn't great. With the 0 to 60 time of 12 seconds, you aren't exactly going to turn heads, and while this may not seem like such a bad quality, I certainly wouldn't describe it as an advantage for the car. Despite the fact that you could basically use any fuel you liked, the fuel economy still was not great. The engine were idle between 18,000 and 22,000 RPMs, and to put that in perspective for you, that's a lot. Also, might be worth mentioning that it was pretty loud, which is fair when you consider that this is basically a miniature jet engine. While these were all pretty serious problems that needed to be addressed, I think how Chrysler's turbine research program ended best describes what I think the biggest problem with the turbine engine is. The turbine engine program officially ended in 1979 because of all these issues I mentioned, as well as a condition from the government in response to Chrysler asking them for a loan. This right here is what I think is the true obstacle for the turbine engine: outside factors. The concept of a turbine engine in itself isn't a bad idea. It has plenty of promise, which is why so many people have tried it in the first place. Engineers are smart. Given the financial backing and sufficient time, I have no doubt that they would be able to work out these problems. But I'm afraid it's not up to them. For an idea to move forward, it needs to have our interest. It needs to have momentum. This is something that at the moment the turbine engine just doesn't have. On the other hand, EVs are quickly becoming a hot commodity that everyone wants a piece of, which is why automotive manufacturers are investing huge amounts of time and money into getting their share of the market. There simply isn't enough enthusiasm and interest being placed in turbine technology, and at the end of the day there will always be the question, is it worth it? Is it worth it trying to make gas-powered engines more efficient and more economical, or is it time that we simply look to the future, electricity? Unfortunately for the turbine engine, I do think that it's the latter of these two options. So, there we have it, the story of the turbine car. Is it an end? Only time will tell, but I know I have my opinion.